sort of started thinking about the question of the European Union and peace long time ago, well before the war in Ukraine. But of course, the recent events with the decision by the European Union to admit Ukraine or to start the admission process in Ukraine, and the decision of the Ukrainian government to ask for admission in the European Union is a very interesting starting point for our conversation, because of course the European Union is not a military alliance, it's not NATO. So what is the significance of this decision, if not again to highlight something that specialists know very well, but even people who live in the European Union very often don't know about the European Union, which is why in the end the European Union came into being. The entire process, particularly when it's narrated by political scientists, not very smart political scientists like our colleague here, Carol Leff, who I think I saw briefly as one of the participants, but generally speaking by less sort of big vision political scientists, very often focus on processes, on how and when, rather than on the question of why the European Union. And so I just wanted to focus a little bit on this question of the European Union and the idea of peace. Again, mostly to provide a little bit of an intellectual history of the European Union rather than an institutional history of the European Union or a history of the idea of Europe. Both are very interesting topics, right? What is Europe? How do we define Europe? What are the borders of Europe? This is something that has been discussed relentlessly by Europeans, at least since the 16th century, but it's not the topic of our discussion. Does Ukraine, for instance, belong to Europe? Does Russia belong to Europe? Is the United Kingdom part of Europe? Turkey? All very interesting questions, but not something I'm going to address today. Similarly, again, I'm not going to address the history of the institutions from the treaties of Rome to the present, when they were created and what was the specific purpose. Again, I think that most of you, if not all of you, are high school teachers or teachers in general. So I think that if you go to talk to your students about the institutional history of the European Union, you create a revolution in your class. The parents will call you to insult you. So I hope we stay away from this topic. And instead, I'm trying to look at this question of history, as I always do in my classes, from a rational perspective, which is to say of why certain things happen, what are the motivations, the human motivations behind certain events, right? And so in doing so, let's see if I can, I just want to make three major points here. One, again, the theories of the causes of war. We have to go a little bit into the question of why people believe, and by people I mean mostly political scientists, why people believe that wars happen. If we're talking about peace, of course, the causes of something is crucial to understand how to prevent that from happening. And so if you're talking about war, the causes of war are crucial to understand what can create peace. Then I'm going to talk about how during this period in European history, the period that is usually identified as the Enlightenment, which for those of you who took history classes, European history classes, or even American history classes in college might remember, it's basically the period around the American Revolution, right? So if you are familiar with the American Revolution, which I assume you all are, you know how these people dressed, some of the ideas they had, and how they tried to solve some of the problems. Now, we are going to look not at the American side of the Enlightenment, not even at the British side of the Enlightenment, but the specific continental European theory of peace that emerged during the Enlightenment. To move to this question of the evolution of wars in Europe, right? If wars had remained what they were in the 15th century, I don't know if peace would be such a major issue for us. Certainly, if wars had remained what they were in the 13th century, we probably wouldn't worry that much about war. Italians sort of complained when firearms were introduced by the fact that all of a sudden people want to kill people when they were fighting wars, something that Italians never exactly understood. I'm Italian, so that's why I'm mentioning Italy here. You know, people would fight for days and days by sort of using swords, and sometimes you would die, but more often than not, you would just basically lay down or with some sort of wound, or even run away without too many people getting killed, because it's very hard to kill people with swords, particularly when you're wearing some sort of protection. So the evolution of wars and the violence that all of a sudden characterize modern wars changed the importance of peace and made this idea of the philosophy of peace that was developed during the Enlightenment significantly more relevant for human history. And finally, as a sort of last historical step, I'm going to say just a couple of words about fascism, because fascism, of course, and Nazism were a big part of this evolution for multiple reasons. But as I will mention during my presentation, one of the main reasons is that fascism and Nazism, contrary to basically all the philosophies that came out of the Enlightenment, liberalism, democracy, socialism, and that existed before the Enlightenment, particularly the sort of philosophy of history that came from the Christian tradition. All these philosophies believed that peace was a desirable goal, was something that people wanted and that people deserved. Perhaps a goal that could not be achieved, but nonetheless a very desirable goal. But you know, fascism and Nazism instead really had a different perspective on this. They believed that war was good, that war was desirable, that war was the engine of history, and that war was a crucial human activity for the purification and regeneration of human nations and races. So fascism contested the idea of peace and promoted war very actively. And finally, as our last step, this question of the European Union, again, that comes right after World War II, as, again, a response to the coming together of these events, right? This philosophy of history and peace that was basically started during the Enlightenment, the evolution of wars in Europe from World War I and World War II, a reaction against fascism, and the question of peace, again, as a goal that needed to be achieved to save European civilization from self-destructing. Now I'm gonna take a look. Hey, Jill, nice to see you. Any questions so far? Feel free to unmute yourself. Very good. So if we start from the first point, right, the European Union, why, right? I was sort of just wanted to remind you that we are looking at this question of peace as really the reason why people basically decided to put together this major new construction that is the European Union. Again, not the how, not the when, but the main reason. Again, the question of war is crucial. And again, I was asking the question of why war? What are the major theories that explain war? Again, when I talk to students today, they all have sort of some theories about war. It's something that every human being at a certain point formulates. You can actually, I would say, my at this point teaching experience determine how desperate a generation of young people is in relation to the future by asking them a question about war. The more they tend to tell you that war is inevitable, is natural, and nothing will ever change that, the more you can make the assumption that this is a generation that's a generation of people who have lost hope in a better future and who believe they are more the victims of history than the protagonists of history. Again, but this is a sort of side consideration that doesn't change much, except telling you about my sort of tricks to understand the people I'm talking to when I'm talking to my class. And so when it comes to explanations of war, again, there are literally hundreds of different combinations of different ideas of wars, but we can basically identify three major ways of explaining why wars happen. Explanations that center around the individuals, in explanations that center around the internal organization of states, particularly of nation states, how they are organized internally, their internal politics, their internal ideology, and so on and so forth. And a third, again, major way of explaining why wars happen, focusing instead on the international system. Again, in most cases, it's a combination of these three dimensions that we are discussing. But again, for the purpose of categorization and for the purpose, again, of learning how to explain this to students, I would say that it's a useful categorization to think about these three big categories. So when we're talking about explanations that are centered around individuals, some explanations, again, focus on the question of human nature. Why wars happen? Most explanations would say that are centered on human nature would say that we are violent, we are evil, we are inclined to violence, we are at least imperfect. And so because we are imperfect, because we are potentially violent, again, if we go back in time to theological Christian explanations, for instance, you could point to the sort of original sins or evil as a presence in the world. But again, regardless of the individual explanation, there is something that characterizes human nature that makes it imperfect. And because of the imperfection of human nature, violence happens in history, and among violence, there is war. Or again, sometimes this is not the evilness or the imperfection of people in general, but the specific imperfection of a nation's leader. So again, sometimes you don't say that the people who started a war, like Russians, are as human beings evil, or that Russians are evil, or they are cooked, or whatever you want to say. But you say that the leader, that Putin, or or Biden or Trump or whatever leader you want to hold responsible for war is again flawed, evil, violent, and so on and so forth. So the question of the leaders and their personality belongs to this big category of explanations of war based on individuals, right? Either the general individuals, the general population, or the specific leaders. This is one major way of explaining wars. When the Western Balkans became a part of the EU, that's a very interesting question, but I think we can have it for a different discussion. Now, the second sort of large group of set of explanations that focus instead on why we have wars in human history tend to focus on the organization of states. So the political organization, right? So for instance, there is a long-standing theory that suggests that republics or democracies are less inclined to start wars than dictatorships. The explanation being that because democratic leaders have to answer to their constituency, it's significantly harder for them to justify a random war because they can be voted out of office. People don't like to die. People don't like to see so much destruction. And so this organization, this political organization theory, again, you can agree, you can disagree. It's not really relevant here if we agree or we disagree with this. We just look at the sort of categories. Again, looks at how a state is organized. Is a dictatorship or is a democracy? What kind of participation? Is there a free press and not? And again, this theory usually points to the fact that the existence of autocratic governments without free press tend to inspire violence precisely because people are not informed, they are the victims of propaganda, and so on and so forth. Whereas democratic governments and free press in particular are, according to this theory, more inclined to be peaceful. And then there are theories that focus not so much on the political organization, but on the economic organization within states. Again, particularly the socialist tradition blames competitive capitalism, the idea of securing resources in a competitive struggle for the maximization of profit, for the beginning of wars. Capitalism, on the other hand, again, normally capitalist economies blame socialism for being similar to war economies, being overly organized, and so on and so forth, creating a weaker civil society. So explanations that focus on the economy. Finally, within this question that focuses, this answer that focuses on nation states and their organization rather than individuals, a last sort of general big category is the idea of ideology, religion. Are Christian peaceful? Are Muslim peaceful? Are whatever religion you want to mention here peaceful? Are ideologies peaceful? Are communists peaceful? Are socialists peaceful? Are whatever, again, ideology you want to put there, peaceful? The political culture of a place as an explanation of the beginning of wars. So we look at these two explanations, those two sets of explanations. Again, there are multiple explanations, but one focuses on individuals. The other one focuses on political organizations within the state. Finally, the third major one, which again is significantly less clear to the general public, I would say, is the question of the international system. Now, people, again, sometimes focus on the personality of their leaders. Sometimes they focus on, again, the question of the ideology of certain places or the economic organization of certain places. But this instead looks at the question of the international system as such. States weaken, corporations go, the use of union states, so it is weakening. Right? It's never it's never that simple, right? I mean, but we should determine what weakening is, but we can discuss that. That's an interesting point you're making. So in this case, again, this question of international systems, for instance, look at the question of free trade or protectionism, right? Am I free to access resources in the international division of labor freely, or people are denying me resources that I think are crucial for my economy? For instance, let's say that you need access to certain rare materials in another country that are crucial for your economy, perhaps, I don't know, to make computers or other important goods, and that country is simply refusing to sell it to you because they want to weaken you. That's a form of protectionism. They want to keep your economy weaker. Is that something that creates war or it creates peace? Free trade, again, instead this question again of the ability of trading, does it impact peace and war? There are theories that, again, say that free trade, generally speaking, improve peace. Again, you don't have to agree. I personally am a little bit skeptical, but nonetheless, these are traditional theories. The question of military alliances, we have seen this, I think, in the news very, very recently. The question of NATO, and NATO, of course, is a military alliance, and Russia blaming NATO as a military alliance as a threat to its own security. You are a tiny country, Estonia, Lithuania, whatever, you don't necessarily are a threat to me as a tiny country, but because you belong to this very, very large military alliance, I'm not facing you as a nation state, but I'm facing you as a set of states that, again, can threaten me. And so military alliances change the relative strength of individual nation states, changing the balance of power. And so when is it legitimate for somebody to feel threatened by a military alliance, particularly when the military alliance perhaps is secret, or when the military alliance is not exactly clear, but we can understand how military alliances are part of this international system. But finally, and I hope you're still with me, I would say the big one, which is the so-called anarchic structure of the international system.
They know how.
And the anarchic structure of the international system stands for the idea that, and again, I could put many citations here, that basically nation states are just like individuals in a state of nature, without the need to respond to anyone but themselves. Now, of course, you can imagine a situation where, again, Russia or China or the United States or all nuclear powers can be sensitive to pressure, but basically if Putin or Xi or Biden say, okay, I'm going to invade that country, who is going to stop that? I mean, again, this is, again, it's a situation, honestly, similar to a situation where you have high school or elementary school kids on a playground. If you remove all the teachers and all the supervision, right, all of a sudden, the biggest ones can basically establish their dominance over their peers. And if there is no authority there stopping them and telling them, I'm going to punish you, who is going to stop the strongest kid on the block to sort of enforce his or her will? So this anarchic structure, the lack of law, right? Anarchy is a fancy Greek word that basically means that there are no laws, creates a situation where the strongest rules and the weakest is ruled, and creates an incentive for people to use strength to achieve their goals. Now, again, we don't have to go very far. Russia believed it was strong. It believed that Ukraine was weaker, and that because it was about to join a military alliance that could make it stronger and change the balance of power, this was a good moment to use its own strength to gain some territories. Because again, in the end, what are you going to do? I mean, so the anarchic structure of the international system is something that is not normally considered by citizens, but is certainly a big part of the theory of peace that emerged during the Enlightenment as an issue. Now, again, variations of these theories of the causes of war were developed from antiquity to early modernity. Right. So again, I'm categorizing them for you, but it's not something I'm inventing. It's not something that somebody invented. There are so many instances in history of these explanations. Thank you, Jill. Again, there is a sort of parallel debate, which we don't have time or for, perhaps even reasons to cover, on the question of just and unjust war. These explanations on just and unjust war run parallel to these questions of why war, but they are not necessarily the same. So we are leaving them in parentheses, just in case you perhaps have some curiosity about them. And again, the crucial thing is to remember that these explanations go back in time. I'm just going to give you an example, a very old one, the oldest I could find, of how, in the end, explanations of the causes of war in antiquity are not very different from the ones we give today sometimes, right? So Herodotus, we're talking about the 5th century before the current era, so we're talking about the 400 something before our calendar, give or take 2,400 years ago. Herodotus, a Greek historian, he's talking about the reasons why the Persian Empire, this big bully of the time, invaded Greece. Greece being, again, divided in small city-states, Athens, Sparta, all these city-states, and the Persians decided to invade. They don't know exactly why. They don't have spies in the Persian Empire, but they try to imagine what could have caused this invasion. And so Herodotus, who is a historian, but being a historian of antiquity, had the license of imagining things rather than proving things. Imagine a dialogue between Darius, the emperor of Persia, the sort of the person in charge, the leader of Persia, and his wife, whose name was Atossa, about why he started this war against the Greeks. And again, the explanation that is provided basically says, one, to distract the populace from local problems. It says, things are not going very well here in Persia, so let's start this war so people don't pay too much attention to what's going on here. Then we find there is what is usually referred to as the rally to the flag. We are all of a sudden we are fighting against the Greeks, so we forget about our problems, but also we forget about our differences. Compared to the Greeks we are fighting, we can sort of being one, and so this will make us stronger and more united. Then I will prove my manliness, right? This goes to sort of an interesting long-term explanation of the psychology or the personal motivations of leaders, the question of masculinity, the question of honor, the question of aggressiveness. So it says, I will prove that I'm a warrior and that everybody else is not. And finally, of course, we are going to make a lot of money out of this war, right? So basically, the explanations that Herodotus give, I don't know about you, but are probably not very different from what people, normal people would say causes war today, right? Perhaps the manliness thing would be sort of transformed into something else, but pretty much I would say we are on the same page. Now, these explanations became a little bit more refined over time. So the question, for instance, of manliness or the question of personal motivations became, again, questions about psychology and the sort of even psychopathology, the mental problems of the leaders sometimes. Here you have in famous book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness by the German sociologist Erich Fromm, this sort of way of contesting this psychological, psychoanalytic explanation of war. It has become fashionable to consider war as caused by the powers of man's destructive instinct. Instinctivists and psychoanalysts have given these explanation of war. Thus, for instance, an important representative of psychoanalytic orthodoxy, Glover, argues against Ginsburg that the riddle of war lies deep in the unconscious, and he compares war with an expedient form of instinctive adaptation. So basically, again, explanation that, again, as I was saying before, say we are imperfect, we are destructive, we have mental problems, our leaders do too. So sometimes this creates wars because we like destroying things and not just being peaceful beings. Again, the same kind of explanation moves from, again, the psychoanalytical unconscious. You have unsolved mental issues to the economic explanations with a similar focus on the sort of instead rationality of war. Here I'm looking at Jack Hisselfer, who is an economist, who is generally considered a major voice in the economic explanations of war from, again, a non-Marxist, non-socialist perspective, with the idea, again, of why human beings in general, regardless of their economic organization, fight wars. It says wars are fought not only for material goals. We saw that even our friend, the emperor of Persia, wanted to prove his manliness, but for intangible ends such as honor and prestige, right? That this sort of Herodotus' manliness is, in this case, honor and prestige. Like many other animals, humans seek food and sex directly, but also indirectly via dominance and prestige. In modern times, the direct food and sex motives for warfare have waned, but although largely disconnected from reproductive success, intelligible goals such as prestige, dominance, and respect, amplified by the affiliative instinct, remain with us as continuing causes of war. So basically, he says we are not what we think we are, right? Like the psychoanalyst will tell us, you are not what you think you are. You are a much more complicated being underneath our appearance. He's saying underneath our fancy clothes and our dreams of civilization, we remain basically animals looking for honor and prestige and food, directly or indirectly. So we continue to fight for resources, including sort of immaterial resources that allow us to accumulate honor and prestige that translates into a better chance to reproduce. And so as such, if you are a warrior, if you win wars, you get more money, as Darius wanted, or more manliness, as Darius again wanted, right? So I'm just playing around a little bit to show you how for 2,400 years, if we look beyond the language that changes, there is a sort of continuity of explanation, right? I hope you're happy to play the game with me. Now, during the Enlightenment, the question was, okay, so because the explanations are pretty much clear, what do we do about it? I mean, okay, we know, we have been talking about this for 2,000 years. And the Enlightenment, as those of you, again, who remember this magnificent period of time when people wanted to get rid of the darkness of the previous era, they wanted to start something new, they wanted to solve the big problems that they thought they inherited from the past, only because people were not trying to solve them, only because people were constantly doing the same thing over and over again. Instead, they just wanted to start something that was radically new. Right, exactly, right. I mean, all of this, right? I agree with the comments in chat that, again, if we look at the sort of psychological explanations, all these are very valid, the contributions to the multitude of psychological explanations, lack of diversity, lack of understanding of other cultures, and so on and so forth. These are very, very important points. But again, what do we do about it, right? I mean, how do we solve the problem? And again, they were coming from the Christian tradition that always said that war was evil. I mean, there were just wars, of course, but generally speaking, war was bad. The idea of peace is very, very important for European Christians as a concept, and perhaps not as a practice, but certainly as a concept. And they were trying to solve this problem once and for all. And so they thought that eliminating war meant to eliminate the causes of war. How do you do that? What can you do? Oops. So the most important figure who came up with this idea of perpetual peace, right? He literally wrote a very important pamphlet. It's not exactly a book, it's a short text. Can even be assigned in high school, for those of you who teach in high school, to a high school class. It's a little bit ironic. It's basically formulated as an 18th century treaty between two nations. It's meant to make fun of the stupidity of the attempt of European nations to solve this problem by constantly doing the same thing and trying to come up with a new way of solving this problem. Again, the philosopher is Immanuel Kant. He's German by language. He was actually from a city that is now in Russia. It's actually a Russian enclave. It's called Kaliningrad today. So actually, it's one of those regions where now the war is becoming a little bit of a problem because Kaliningrad might be blocked by the countries around, and Russia is threatening an escalation in war if Kaliningrad is blocked. Immanuel Kant lived there, was Prussian, and was one of the most interesting philosophers of the 18th century. He tried to solve it all. He tried to answer the three crucial questions of philosophy. What can we know? How should we behave? What is beautiful and what is not? These are the basically three crucial questions of philosophy. And he also tried to tackle this problem of how do we achieve peace, right? And in order to solve that, he had an idea and he said, okay, why don't we go about this as we do with the penal system, with the criminal law? So he had some premises that I think it's interesting to share, right? One, human beings are not angels, right? We all agree. I mean, we have, even our best friends are not angels. We know that. Our spouses, our companions sometimes have shortcomings. I certainly do a lot. So we are not angels, but we are rational, right? We are not necessarily inclined to do good all the time, but because we are rational, we know that if the punishment is superior to what we gain, perhaps even if we want to do evil, we don't, right? So, you might desire some sort of sexual escapades or something like that, but you think of your children, you think of your family, you think of your personal life, and if all of that falls apart, or perhaps you want to tell your boss that the person is really not so smart, but then you think of your job, you think of your family. So we are not necessarily always inclined to do good, but we are rational even as children. And so we know that if we do bad things and we get punished, we stop doing them because we don't want to get punished and being in a position where we lose more than we gain. And so out of this sort of consequence, there is this big solution, right? Because we are imperfect, we need laws and punishments, right? So if you have a disruptive student in class, you have to punish the student so that the student knows that that's not an acceptable behavior. 2.1, human beings will avoid violence if the punishment is bigger than the reward and fairly certain. Now, if I have a reasonable expectation to get away with things, perhaps I will continue to do bad things. But if I have a reasonable expectation of being punished, I will not do those bad things. Now, if this happens to human beings, why don't we do the same with states, right? States are not governed by angels, but states behave rationally. So we need a system of laws and punishments that instead of applying just to individuals, applies to states. If Russia invades Ukraine, you have to punish Russia, right? And the punishment has to be fairly certain and commensurate to the crime so that you are discouraged from starting a war, because what you are going to lose is bigger than what you're going to gain out of it. Now, now he also thought about a different kind of solution, a simple solution, right? The simple solution would be, okay, wars happen because there are different states in the world. Because there is the United States, there is Brazil, there is Mexico, there is Belgium, there is Russia. Why do we sort of build a gigantic single human state? We eliminate the need for war. We all live in one single nation and that's it, right? War will not happen. But he rejects that solution strongly because he basically said, okay, what happens if that state goes wrong, right? Now, if Canada becomes a dictatorship, I run to the United States or vice versa. But if I live in a state that is a world state and that state becomes a criminal state, where do I run to? So the sort of preservation of freedom of individuals, of the possibility of being refugees, literally, says, okay, it would be a nice solution for war to eliminate human states and make just one big state, but it will come with so many problems that it's probably better not to do that. So rather than just one single big state, let's create federations of states. Federations of states. It would be the end of the anarchy of international relations, because there would be an authority above that would punish individual states for starting wars. There would be a system of punishments. The autonomy of states would be preserved. Right? So it's not one state, it's, again, a federation. Now, all of this, and I'm going to speed up a little bit now. I'll try to move again from philosophy to history a little bit here, because again, I think all of this is sort of very theoretical at this point, right? So in the 18th century, they are looking at these problems, they're looking at new constitutions, they are looking at new solutions. They tried really their best to go from something that was based on tradition to something that was based on rationality. The easiest example, of course, is Kant's idea of trying to transform the Christian, the Jewish Christian idea that you should treat other people as you wanted them to treat you, into a sort of universality principle. Before you do something, ask yourself, do you want to live in a world where everybody does that? I mean, perhaps it's convenient for you to steal $10, $100, but do you want to live in a world where everybody steals? This kind of stuff, right? They are trying to go from something that comes from tradition to something that is similar or even the same, but is based not on sharing values, but on sharing what they thought we had in common, which is rationality, our ability to understand things. And when I mean we have in common, they literally meant everybody, right? I mean, they were aware of the existence of different cultures, China, India, they were Africa, they were very familiar with this culture at this point. They respected the humanity of all these people. Even gender distinctions were, they were aware they were not human distinctions. So men, women, people from Africa, people from Asia, we share one thing. We are divided by culture, but we are united by rationality. So let's find a solution that is based on rationality. Now, but all this would be sort of an exercise if had not been for the fact that already in the 18th and 19th century, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of European wars. And in the 18th century, when Immanuel Kant was writing, they were fought for territorial gain, and they were based on limited violence. You have seen the images, right? But already at the end of the 18th century, the birth of the new revolutionary republics, the United States and France, transformed wars from means to solve territorial disputes into wars to protect a political and ideological system. Now, when people fought against France in Europe in particular, they were not just fighting to get a little piece of France or for France to get a little piece of Germany or Italy or Spain. They were fighting for the revolution, they were fighting for the republic, they were fighting for a constitution, or they were fighting for a monarchy, they were fighting for the idea of religion. The people in the Austrian Empire or in the German or Italians anti-revolutionary side believed that these people who had killed the king were there to destroy religion, to destroy order, but the new antichrist, they were the new disruptive force that instead of following tradition was following this new crazy idea that would destroy society. And the people on the other side thought that instead they were fighting in the name of progress against people who wanted people to be forever slaves of tradition. So this changes the war, right? I mean, if I come to your house, and please don't take this literally, I will not come to your house to steal $100, we understand each other, right? Perhaps you will shoot me. I hope you won't, but you know, in and out, right? I take $100 and that's it. But if I come to your house believing that you are evil and I'm gonna kill you and your children, you don't ask questions. You start shooting if you have a gun right away, right? So this existential transformation changes war in a very profound way. People feel that their way of life is threatened in a way that 18th century wars did not present to them. Now, so, oops. There is also a sort of, again, this is not necessarily the most crucial transformation at the time. Not everybody is aware of this, but people are becoming incredibly more aware of this very, very quickly, because it's no longer professional soldiers, but general people, people's soldiers, sort of the National Guards, the regular people who are fighting. Also, this question of the violence of war is perceived as stronger. Again, it's not just a professional soldier or mercenary that is killed, but it's your son, is your daughter who got killed. And the fact that, again, that it's a sort of existential threat makes the rational calculations increasingly irrelevant. Again, if I'm coming to kill you, the question of how do I react is as strongly as I can, right? So it's not a sort of easy calculation as it was when it was a time of territorial gain. There is also, again, finally, this interesting moment in human history that is the end of the age of exploration. Now, again, Europeans don't like to talk about this very much anymore, but it was very present at the time. For 3 centuries, they had explored the world and sort of gained control over more and more resources. And all of a sudden, during the 19th century, the exploration is over, the world is divided. And so if you're a newcomer, like Germany, for instance, or Italy, and the UK is there before you, or France is there before you, the question of, okay, how do I get access to the resources because I came late? So this question of the limited resources is making increasingly this conflict questions of if I don't secure enough resources for the future of my population, threatening to my own very existence. And so economic calculations and ideological calculations made the possibility of war less likely, because people understood immediately that these new gigantic industrial states had the capacity to destroy people much more than in the past. So less likely, but when they happen, they are more destructive. They are incredibly destructive. And of course, we can jump ahead with a sort of big, gigantic transformation in war that is World War I, right? All of a sudden, everybody is mobilized. All the resources are used for war. War is no longer just a question of this or that. Nobody understands exactly why they started, but once it starts, nobody can stop. everybody's an enemy. The French hate the Germans hated the French, the Italians hated the Austrians hated the Russians hated everybody, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of ideology going on, a lot of nationalism that is emerging as a destructive ideology, a lot of industrial power behind this ideology, a lot of questions of, if I don't secure the resources right now, my nation is going to be screwed for the rest of its life, all at once, leading to the use of gas, massacres, total destruction. That is, whoa, whoa. The general population is mobilized. It's no longer just the people who are fighting. Even the people at home have to fight the war. Right? We all know this because we know that, for instance, women gain a little bit of social power because men were all fighting, and so women were at home running the economy for the first time, and so they had a little bit of negotiation power. And so right after World War I, of course, in the United States, you have women gaining the right to vote because their war efforts somehow is recognized. An entire society is transformed. And in Europe, this creates a situation where nobody is able to win the war. It's a stalemate. Russia changes dramatically in 1917, and we know becomes a communist country that changes the entire game. And the US intervenes in the war, and it's the crucial power that changes the balance of power in Europe. And that plus the colonial troops, people from Africa, Black men from Africa being brought, mostly by the French, to fight in Europe, terrorize the hell out of Europeans who now all of a sudden discover that for 3 centuries they had fought wars against the rest of the world, where they were the ones going around the world, conquering this or that territory and dictating what the world could do. All of a sudden, instead, they are the battlefield of a non-European power, the United States, that wins the war and changes the balance of power, and that there are non-Europeans fighting on European territory. Now, they came out of World War I and they asked, why did we have this war? I mean, how did it start? And the American president, Woodrow Wilson, had a sort of usual set of explanations, plus one, authoritarian governments, the psychology of the leaders, the fact that there was economic protectionism, and so on and so forth. But most importantly, he thought that democracy was the solution, and democracy meant that each people had the right to self-determination. And in order to do that, you had to multiply the correspondence between one people and one nation. Italy for Italians, Germany for Germans, Austria for Austrians, France for France, Belgium for Belgians, whatever Belgium is, since it's a combination at least of 2 different languages and nations. Actually, at least 3. There are also Germans in Belgium. But the principle of multiplying the nation states was used to basically create more democratic society where the correspondence between the governors and the governed on the basis of the nationality principle was affirmed. But also, interestingly enough, the sort of ancestor of the UN, the League of Nations, was created with the idea that nation states needed to be policed in order not to start new wars. So this idea of the anarchy of the international relations, the idea that if you don't have a power above the states will behave like bullies, was somehow partially solved with this idea of the League of Nations as an idea. The United States ended up not joining the League of Nations, which was a major problem, but there was already a sort of general understanding that if you let the European and the other nations run on their own, wars will happen again. You need to have laws that govern international relations. And in the 1920s, you see the appearance of the first Europeanist movement. This guy is an Austrian guy whose name was Kudenove-Kalergi. He was the son of a Japanese and an Austrian count. So he was multicultural, if there is one way of being multicultural in Europe in the 1920s. He wrote this very successful book titled Pan-Europa, which is, of course, means Europe as one, or unity of Europe, that became incredibly successful and ended up creating a movement called Pan-Europa itself that started to press for the idea of a European federation, to the point that in 1928, the French foreign minister, Aristide Briand, who was trying to find a solution for the relationship between France and Germany, launched the idea of a European Union, what he called a sort of European federation. Let's stop this madness of the multiplication of states. We are running down the path of a new war. We have to create a European federation. We have to create a European unity if we want to make peace in Europe. Now, that ended poorly. It failed in 1932, more because nobody wants to give up sovereignty. You go to any government, you go to the United States government and tell the United States government, okay, why don't you let people in Germany decide about the American people? And they will laugh at you. And the same happened in Europe at the time. Nobody was ready to give up elements of sovereignty. And so the power of persuasion that the Pan-Europa movement and other movements of the time that wanted to create a European federation failed against the reality. Most importantly, right after, it was already too late, right? I mean, it was not part of the peace process. We are in 1932, the year after Hitler seized power. He took Germany out from the League of Nations, so even from that tiny organization that existed to prevent nation states to operate like bandits on the international space. That's the first thing it does. And the League of Nations, without the United States, without Germany, without muscles, proves unable to prevent the following tragedies: the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and the conquering of Ethiopia with the use of gas against the local populations, the Japanese invasion of China, and the creation of the Manchukuo, so the puppet state in the north, the Spanish Civil War, and World War II. Now, again, literally the last 5 minutes, but very quickly here. Now, the interesting thing is that we are also at a time when there are all these peace-seeking movements, but Europeans are also, in some cases, starting to think that perhaps peace is not the right way to go, right? So again, this is a sort of joking quote about the fact that during the wars, during the Renaissance, Florence produced Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, the Renaissance, whereas Switzerland, very peaceful nation, gave us nothing, right? So is war really bad? Again, this is a little bit of a joke, but the fascists and the Nazis really centered their ideology on the idea that war is not only natural, but it is the way to go, right? So the Italian proto-fascist futurists, the ones who sort of came up with the original ideology, started to describe war as the necessary hygiene of the world. It's a way for healthy organisms to get rid of weak organisms. It's a way for people to prove their strength, to develop values, to develop sense of sacrifice, sense of duty, to be strong against the weak, against those who instead are just surviving by not competing. And fascism rejected the Enlightenment tradition altogether, right? So it's not based on the idea of peace. It's not based on the idea of rationality. And the idea that war is, again, the engine of human progress and the natural law of history is one of the most one of the clearest characteristics of these ideologies. They like war, they like warriors, and they think that war is the way to go. So all of a sudden we have a new combination where the European economic system is failing, the political system has not made steps toward sort of a peaceful solution. The desire for territorial gains is increasing. Ideology is denying even that peace is a desirable objective. And it's not surprising that World War II happens. Everybody understands why World War II happens. World War I is complicated, but World War II is not. And at the end of World War II, what people during the interwar period feared, what Europeans during the interwar period feared, happened. Europe basically lost most of its independence, right? I mean, France, Germany, Italy, in different ways, are semi-independent states. France is a little bit more independent, but Germany and Italy, as defeated nations, have to follow certain rules. They have to give up their colonial empires. They cannot have a certain kind of army and so on and so forth. There are military bases, American military bases, and Russian military bases around Europe. And as we all know, if you live in Czechoslovakia and you want to go in a different way, the Russians come, and as it's probably the case in Western Europe, although it's more of a sort of peaceful competition, but still it would have been most likely impossible for a Western nation to join the Soviet Union without creating a major conflict and a major war in Europe. So European nations still exist, but they are with a limited sovereignty, with a limited power to decide for themselves. And in Western Europe, under the pressure of potential confrontation with the USSR, the question of peace must be solved once and for all. Now, there is a big enemy on the other side, really big one that soon has nuclear power. They won the war. Russia won the war. They have expansionist tendencies, according to at least to the West, but most likely the right. So if Germany and France are fighting again, the Russians will invade, or something terrible will happen even more, right? And what happens in the new sort of World War III scenario is something that nobody wants. So when the sovereignty of France, Italy, and Germany is purely theoretical, it's a little bit easier for these states to accept the transfer of sovereignty to the non-national level. So the European Union as a concept becomes a little bit more easy to sell to people because they are already aware of the fact that their sovereignty is limited. Economic nationalism, again, the destruction is so major, and the forms of government must be compatible and democratic because they are part of a Western alliance that also requires it. And in this context, the European Union and its idea of solving the permanent anarchy of international relations in Western Europe becomes the sort of successful move that the former enemies, France and Germany and Italy and Belgium and the Netherlands, of course, and Luxembourg too, devised as a way of finally putting an end to this incredibly long history of European conflicts. And this is, again, this is what people have a hard time realizing, going back to the why and ending my presentation here, that the European Union is a lot of different things, is a very big commercial space, is a fantastic area to visit during the summer and so on and so forth. But most importantly, it's the most successful example in history of multiple nations, but let's just focus on France and Germany, on two nations that almost destroyed themselves twice in a very short space, who consider each other existential threats, who consider each other incompatible with their own civilizations. They consider each other enemies for life, to all of a sudden make peace to a level that somehow makes the idea of a conflict between France, Germany, and Italy today unimaginable to the people who live in these states in the European Union. It's not happening for the world, clearly. There is a question of what's happening right now, for instance, in Ukraine, but it makes total sense for Ukraine to join this process of peace and sort of become an area, join an area where peace is a crucial sort of foundational value. And again, it's not unfortunate for the world, but Kant's idea of perpetual peace, at least as perpetual as human ideas are, seems to live on within the states of the European Union, that again, more than for their shortcomings or their economic success, should be judged, I think, fairly for their ability to take enemies, and after the fall of communism, another group of enemies in Eastern Europe, and make them part of a peaceful union.